Thank you, Marco. Thanks very much for the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Thanks for all of you for staying until the end of the conference to discuss this topic. And it is really my pleasure to be here. But I do not know this crowd very much. Let me just give you a little bit of a review what my background is. I am a professor, and so this is a crowd that is a very diverse crowd with a lot of people from industry. I'm in academia. I'm a professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering in the US. I'm also a member of the board of NumFOCUS, and I have been since 2015. I'm associate editor of the associate editor-in-chief of the Journal of Open Source Software, JOSS. It's been mentioned before, and JOSS is a project that is affiliated, it's a sponsor project of NumFOCUS. And I've been a champion of open source software for research and education for many years. But in regards to the topic that I wanted to share with you today, in my role as an academic, as an educator, I have taken the opportunity to advance diversity through both systemic activities and sometimes eclectic minor actions that you have the opportunity to do in your spheres. But some of the public-facing narratives that reflect my contributions to diversity include a collaboration with NVIDIA to promote women in GPU computing that was done in 2014 via a campaign that was called Women Hokuda, and it was launched with a blog post and several activities that include a web page on the NVIDIA developers blog showcasing 30 women that were working with GPU computing. This is a few years back. And for some years, I've been speaking against male-dominated conferences in engineering as well. You can find some of my writings about that topic on Medium. Here's a couple of examples. And of course, lots of salty tweets. The last item here is in this slide is a long essay I wrote last year to accompany the keynote, luncheon keynote that I gave at SciPy. And today's talk is going to be an update and a complement to that. Let's remember, 2 years ago, a Google engineer attended a diversity program. He had such an adverse reaction to it that he proceeded to write a 10-page manifesto that he circulated originally in internal channels. And among other things, he said that biological differences are the root cause of women's underrepresentation in technology. This memo was made public in this article on Gizmodo in August 2017. The engineer was soon fired. Google CEO said that parts of that memo violated the code of conduct that crossed the line, advancing harmful gender stereotypes. The engineer soon, of course, became the hero of conservative media and who banded in his support. He tried to sue Google in January of 2018 for discrimination against white conservative men. The National Labor Relations Board declared a month later that the firing was legal, and so the discriminatory portions of the memo were legal basis for the firing, and so this was the end of that. But champions were quick to start plugging supporting material for this biological differences claim, like this opinion piece that appeared in the Globe and Mail. The author here is citing, to support this idea of gender differences, a paper that does talk about sex differences in the mammalian brain, which looked at the effects of hormonal exposure on sex-specific gene expression changes on embryonic natural stem cells in mice. So quite a big jump there from gene expression changes to biology's influence on interests, don't you think? Of course, sex differences exist in the brain and the physical traits and even maybe psychological traits. But do these differences have anything to do with interests? This op-ed also cites several other scientific studies that and makes equally big leaps of logic in each case, in my opinion. And just a year after this Google memo, Another big argument just detonated, at least on my circles online, with this article, Why Women Don't Code, by a university lecturer at University of Washington in the Pacific Coast. He said that he believes women are less likely than men to want to major in computer science and less likely to pursue a career as a software engineer, and that this is what accounts for the difference and the gender gap in computer science degree programs and in Silicon Valley companies. So just don't want to. He also contrasts in this article this equality versus equity agenda, and he plants himself squarely on the equality idea, rejecting this so-called oppression narrative. He puts scary quotes on that too. And with the argument that the women I talk to in Silicon Valley are enjoying the experience as software engineers, and he then discounts any systematic exclusion from the tech industry. He cites several sources that supports his position, and then the author cites for what is called the free choice argument, the free choice explanation of low representation of women in computer science. He says, we have harvested the low-hanging fruit by eliminating overt discrimination and revamping policies and so on, but now we're stuck. We actually do not see any improvements in the percentage of women going into the computer science. So he says that our community must just face the fact, the difficult truth, that we're not likely to make any more further progress and to attract women to computer science, and women can code, but they just don't want to. We will never reach gender parity, he says. He actually says that his honest view is that the steady state level of women in computer science is about 20%, and we should just accept that. Actually, the comments to this piece show that many folks do agree with him, so it's interesting. We may have many people in the room that agree with that. Now, the suggestion that occupational gender segregation reflects the choices of women often comes with the premise that there's some fundamental biological differences that lead to those choices. Now, but if that were the case, then we would not see examples of rapid desegregation of certain other occupations. For example, like that experienced in medicine. So this is a counter-argument, right? The fraction of medical school graduates who were women rose from 16% in 1975 to 40% in 1995, so just 20 years. So that's very rapid desegregation. Today, medicine has gender parity. Women's interests in this profession changed. Why? Well, perhaps the medical system itself changed to accommodate women, or maybe other reasons. I'm sure there may be studies, or if there are not, it's an interesting research topic. The thing is, people's interests and choices are not innate. They have origins in culture and society. And the science of human development has actually established that people don't choose their interests or occupations freely. Experience, economic opportunities, social expectations, parental guidance, cultural pressures, all those things govern the choices that people make. For some scientific backing, some scientific evidence that demonstrates that culture of a learning community is what determines interests of people joining it. Here's an article. It's this report on a large-scale group surveys of vocational interest, and it's it's simply recording the presence of interest in groups, right? It records the presence, but this can easily be misunderstood to suggest that if interest is not present, it cannot develop. As an educator, and if there's any people that are active educating in the room, we do, of course, believe that those interests can be developed, and we work actively to do so with our students. Interest is a psychological state. Interest can develop and deepen. You have experience. You all have experienced that in your life. And of course, educators can support students to develop that. We believe, otherwise our job would be very depressing. So a little bit about occupational sex segregation to give us context to this. Fewer than 1 in 5 women worked for wages at the turn of the 20th century. Notice my emphasis on wages. Of course, women were working, they were just not being paid, and it's still the case today in many circumstances. By 1940, 27% of American women older than 16 were working for wages, and that rose to 55% by 1986, according to census data, and the figure was 57% in 2017, quite recently. But women and men have always been segregated by occupation at levels that remain stable. The segregation remained at stable levels between 1900 and 1970, so all throughout almost the big part of the 20th century. There are ways that economists can measure the level of occupational sex segregation, and it started to decrease in the 70s as women integrated jobs that were previously dominated by men. So the percentage, on the other hand, of women in the labor force also increased from 38 to 43% in the decade between 1970 and 1980. And many occupations during that time saw disproportionate increases in the representation of women. Variety of sectors, in the service sector, bartending, bus drivers, in the administrative sector, buyers and accountants, public relations professionals, advertising specialists. Many of these professions saw lots of increase in proportion of women, notably computer operators, which were categorized as clerical occupations at the time. Most employed women in the 1970s were in clerical and service positions, semi-professional, and computing occupations were seen as an opportunity for some technical context. But the sector was very vertically segregated. So the systems people were often men, the data enter people were often women. There was segregations within the computer professions in a way also that affects wages. So why so much attention to computer science in this conversation? And one commenter in the Quillet article about why women don't code expressed an often argued counter example, talking about men being underrepresented in many fields like social work, education, psychology, healthcare. Where's all the hand-wringing about how men are being excluded from these professions? So let's be clear. Occupational gender segregation is one of the leading factors in the wage gap. Therefore, desegregating high-paying, high-demand occupations is a social justice concern. That is why there's so much concern about computer science and not so much hand-wringing about men being underrepresented in the nursing occupation. Additionally, researchers in these fields now recognize that there's a form of sex discrimination that is very hard to understand, very hard to decipher. Jobs predominantly filled by men have higher wages than jobs filled predominantly by women, even when the skill, effort, and education levels are comparable. This is the principle of comparable worth, the principle of comparable worth, which deals with this dilemma. For example, in 1975, nurses sued the city of Denver because their wages were lower than tree trimmers and sign painters. Certainly, we cannot say that the nursing professional requires less skill than trimming trees. In California school employees complained in 1985 about librarians and teaching assistants, mostly women, being paid less than men custodians and groundskeepers. So this is the principle of comparable worth. Equally skilled or comparable education, yet jobs filled predominantly by women are paid less. A separate compounded factor, of course, is the hiring discrimination against women seeking to enter predominantly male occupations. Even if some still may disagree, and I'm sure some in the room do disagree, I will state here and assert with strength that moving towards gender parity is the goal. And it is rooted in social justice concerns. The question is how to do it. Another aspect that is important to mention is that evidence has been mounting that companies with more diverse workforces do perform better financially. This is a 2015 study by McKinsey. I will post my slides after I finish, and all my slides have links, active links, so I'll post a PDF and you can follow these links, because I recommend every company leader to read this report. It found that companies in top quartile for gender or racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. They estimate that for every 10% increase in gender diversity in particular, and in the UK also in particular, earnings in the company rose by 3.5%. So it matters to the bottom line to be active and correct these gaps. So how to achieve diversity is the question. Currently, the top intervention at tech companies is implicit bias training. So here's a tweet from Brian Nozick, who's a very well-known psychologist and the director of the Center of Open Science, who does some research in this area. And he tweeted, "There's little evidence that such trainings reduce implicit bias, or that even if they did, that the change in implicit bias addresses the outcomes of interest for diversity and inclusion." They haven't really been studied very well what the effectiveness of these trainings are. Most trainings have not been systematically evaluated. The available evidence suggests that they can change awareness of bias, that it exists, but it doesn't actually change behavior. Finally, training is really not effective at addressing institutional bias. Even if individuals' chosen behavior were to change, we still have structural barriers that persist. Unconscious bias training can actually backfire and have negative effects. So here I recommend this article on how not to suck at implicit bias training. This could be very useful because, in fact, well, the Google memo and all that ensued with that was triggered by an implicit bias training and this engineer being incensed by what happened at that point. So I will assume that it wasn't a very good one. So for some advice, I recommend this Medium post. And for example, when unconscious bias training is made compulsory without some proper messaging or executive sponsorship, some people feel forced to attend and become resentful and combative. And then you have the devil's advocate questions in the room, right? Then they spoil the sessions, cynicism is contagious, and it all goes down from there. Number two, many workshops actually fail to educate people on the harmful effects of unconscious biases. So this leads to normalization, this idea, well, I guess we all have biases. And so it doesn't provoke any meaningful change in people's behavior, just this sense that, well, we're kind of doomed, we'll have this in our culture. Sometimes some trainings will treat unconscious bias as some scientific academic concept that is detached from all of the oppressions that people experience, whether it be racism, sexism, or transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc., that we experience in our society. And really, in order to create real change, we need to understand unconscious bias as a social justice issue. Lack of practical, actionable strategies also make these trainings derail. Awareness alone is not enough to create cultural change. People will just go back to their old habits. And too many organizations think that conducting a one-time, check the box, unconscious bias training will solve all of their diversity and inclusion problems. And it does give some people a sense of satisfaction, but there's just no silver bullet. for creating lasting behavior and cultural change. The final item mentioned in this beautiful article is death by PowerPoint. Of course, that can ruin anything, any presentation. And the bottom line is that a poorly done implicit bias training will actually set your diversity and inclusion efforts back. Most important, having skilled facilitators, and when it comes to conducting any type of workshops, having just read one article and standing in the front and say, I'm going to lead a workshop is probably not going to work. What else can we do? So I've said the most, by far, common intervention is implicit bias trainings. But what else? Quotas, scream emoji. This is such a misunderstood intervention. Almost always, the response to the mere mention of gender quotas or any kind of quota is an argument about meritocracy. We can't lower the bar, right? For example, in 2015, opinions contrary to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's declaration that his cabinet would be made up equally of men and women were vociferously arguing the selection needs to be based on merit. Let's be clear about this. Merit is a fallacy. Education, hiring, promotion, pay, elected officials, none of these are meritocratic. Professor Rainbow Murray said it best in her article on gender quotas in politics in the blog of the London School of Economics. Judgments on quality and merit tend to be based on the status quo. And the opponents of quotas are implicitly arguing for preserving the status quo. Objective measures of merit simply don't exist. What does exist is research evidence that quotas raise quality, contrary to common wisdom. Here's a study, and there are many more. This study in Sweden looked at zipper quotas in municipal politics. So where parties alternated between men and women on the ballot. That's a zipper quota, right? Whenever you apply this alternation of, you can do it in your, I do it in my conference technical committees, make sure that you're alternating and having good balance through that deliberately. This study found that the measure here raised the quality of the men who were elected and the quality of the group overall. Mediocre men were replaced by more highly qualified women. The anti-quota argument is that they are unfair. But what they are in reality is an intervention to fix an already unfair situation. And they raise the overall quality. Think about it. If implicit bias prevents us from making objective assessments of the capabilities of the work of others, and equally qualified men and women are perceived differently, that means that correcting gender bias raises the bar, because we're already measuring people differently from the get-go. And evidence supports that. In April 2017, The Atlantic ran a long read with women in technology, recounting the endless attacks on their professional standing. The undermining of their expertise, the sexual advances at conferences or off-site company events, constant chipping away at their sense of belonging and expertise. The article narrates a report by the Center for Talent Innovation, found that when women drop out of tech, it is usually not for family reasons, but workplace conditions, a lack of access to key creative roles, and a sense of feeling stalled in one's career. Those are the main reasons why women leave. And another recent study, a survey called The Elephant in the Valley of 200 plus senior women in tech, found that 84% of them had been, they're already in Silicon Valley and in senior positions, right? 84% have been told that they were too aggressive. 66% had felt excluded from key networking opportunities because of their gender. 90% had witnessed sexist behavior at conferences and companies off-site events. 88% had experienced clients and colleagues directing questions to male peers that should have been directed at them. 60% had fended off unwanted sexual advances, and in most cases from a superior. Of those women, 1/3 said that they feared for their personal safety. Here's a story about data camp. Many of you must have heard this on Twitter, on the Twitter sphere. It's a big deal because data camp is a big company. It has 3.9 million users over 190 countries and many, many top business customers. And this happened recently it happened actually a long time ago, but it became public recently. At a week-long company event in Portugal, the CEO had too much to drink one evening and groped an employee who was dancing repeatedly. Even if she tried to escape from him, her feelings of humiliation lingered for long after the event, and she quit after 3 months. She reported the incident to her manager as she did so. The reaction of the manager is interesting. He immediately included justifications for the CEO. He's an ethical person. Maybe there's some cultural differences because he's Belgian. The CEO did apologize afterwards and reached out to her in a private apology. And later she learned that the company did want to investigate via a third party. But as the incident became public more than a year later, this third party was revealed to be an early investor in the company, so hardly a neutral person, not to mention unqualified to deal with such matters. And after the investigation concluded, the company's actions were to submit the CEO to sensitivity training, some career coaching, and a strong warning. It also would enforce sexual harassment training for all its employees thereafter, hire a human resources officer, and take some steps to diversify its staff. For the victim, window dressing, but she wanted to move on at this point. Unfortunately, she was burdened with anxiety over running into the CEO, which led her to forego career opportunities. She also had awkward encounters with her ex-colleagues who were friends. And with no public accountability, this story started to spread through informal channels, as they do. And various employees and affiliates started to raise concerns, and they were let down by the company's responses. But this community, this is the R community, the data science community, and it turns out this community is very sensitive to these issues. So they started to self-organize, and they pieced together the story, and a group formed to confront the company collectively. The company, under pressure, held a video call with the community, and that video call ended up being a one-way webinar, and the community felt ever more frustrated. So a subgroup wrote a letter to the company expressing their frustrations and sent it with more than 100 signatories. The day after, DataCamp posted on its blog its first public response with a diluted account of the events and some details on behalf of the harassers and some details that were, made him look better. And this further incensed the community. At this point, a flood of indignations just spread through blog posts and tweets. Like here, after many months of collective negotiating, the instructor community demanding transparency, they did nothing. Their public announcement, not sufficient. So DataCamp instructors started to boycott their own courses, which of course damaged their income, and then posted the content free on alternative platforms where various data science organizations cut ties with the company. I've chosen several tweets here to illustrate my point, and these there will be active links, so you can follow if you're interested in the conversation that happened around this. It really was exploding for a few weeks on Twitter. Some renowned instructors publicized their decision to stop developing courses with them. Others stopped developing content and just dropped out of their intentions to do so. The Software and Data Carpentry is a big organization of volunteer-led workshops in this field, removed all connections, all recommendations to their materials, and issued an official statement regarding this. And at that point, it soon became known that there were 2 DataCamp employees that had raised alarms about the mishandling of the harassment incident not long after it happened, and they had been swiftly fired nominally for poor performance. So at this point, the whole community is up in arms. The pressure mounted, CEO had to step down, and he issued a public apology while the company announced some new investigation and the establishment of a new instructor review board that would bring in the community's input to the company's leadership. So that was the status by April of this year. Many in the community really continued to mistrust. Will the CEO be brought back? Will the investigation go anywhere? The company has a long way to go to rebuild the trust of the community. But here's the thing, a whole community's action was needed to right the wrongs of one harasser and one company's reluctance to make him accountable. This actually had this effect because the community, the art community, the data science community is already very sensitive to these issues, and they just would not have it. The latest update from the interim CEO is from May 28. I see that big jump there of silence. They say that we have been actively searching for and interviewing candidates for a new and independent member of the board of directors, and also that we've been hard at work to establish the instructor advisory board. Hasn't happened yet, and they said the goal is to have the advisory board placed by midsummer. It's midsummer, but we don't have more news. So I think that there's still quite a bit of mistrust produced by this whole episode. So here's a tweet from Bill Batty. He's in the UK, a chief knowledge officer of the Times of Higher Education, who has 25,000 followers on Twitter. So he tweeted, "Okay, what's the most terrible behavior you have witnessed at an academic conference?" He was anticipating, of course, the conference bingo of presenters going over time, asking questions that are more of a comment, or clip art on their PowerPoint, or a wall of text. What he got instead was an avalanche of tweet replies recounting sexual harassment, which obviously surprised him. We have to act on this, he says. His surprise and naivete were not well received, I have to say. Replies pointed out that it's men who need to act on this, because women have been talking about these behaviors for years at a great emotional cost, by the way. Some were more generous with him, explaining that abusive behavior is normalized. So you might not recognize when you see it until you learn to recognize this behavior. So when you do, please call it out. And that's what we've seen, right, in this conference is an increasing adoption of code of conduct. And so how does this address the issue? Some commenters in this thread mentioned this, and this interaction is interesting. First, code of conduct won't necessarily stop sexual harassment, but it will state clearly that such things are unacceptable, that there are boundaries, and that there is redress. Do people need a code of conduct to tell them this? Somebody says, well, yes. Some people do. There's a certain group of men who think that what they do couldn't possibly be sexual harassment. So we all need to learn. And that's why it's important to have these conversations and have the code of conduct be called out by the chair. And actually, over time, as a group, we learn to behave better. But why is sexual assault and sexual harassment so widespread in our society? Is it inevitable? Some sort of animal behavior that we can't avoid because of hormones, whatever? Has it always been that way? Let me tell you about the Cherokee people. The Cherokee nation spoke a language that was devoid of gender bias in their language, okay? It was a matrilineal and matrilocal society at pre-contact times, right, before the Europeans came, where women were sexually liberated, they worked the land, they owned property, they deliberated on matters of war and peace, they could divorce their husbands when they wanted to. Here's a quote from a historian that has written a couple of books about that. Women had autonomy, sexual freedom, could obtain divorce easily, rarely experienced rape or domestic violence, worked as producers, farmers, owned their own homes and fields, possessed a cosmology that contained female supernatural figures, and had significant political and economic power. In fact, Europeans were astonished to see that Cherokee women were the equals of men, politically, economically, theologically. They could not understand the matrilineal social structure. The most important male relative of a Cherokee child was his mother's brother, not his father. Women owned houses that they passed to their daughters. Women participated actively in council meetings in which decisions were made. So reflect on this. Women in the Cherokee Nation did not experience rape or domestic abuse, or rarely experienced, according to historical records, because Cherokee women were the true equals of men. This, for the first time, hit it home for me when you hear that the sexual abuse and harassment is a problem, but it's not about sex, it's about power. And you hear that a lot, and you sometimes don't really internalize or understand. When I read about the Cherokee Nation, it really hit it for me. I really understood how power changes things. The history of Native women really causes us to revise our assumptions about the consequences of sexual differences. There's a direct historical correlation between the US government's greed for land and the erosion of women's power within the tribes. The presence of the Europeans and how that translated in the US government eroded power for women. Colonialism and contact with the Europeans created inequality between the sexes in those groups. Now in the US, a sexual assault occurs every 92 seconds. In the case of rape, 9 out of 10 of the women are female. And 8% of rapes occur while the victim is at work. I have a friend who is an older lady who is a dance professor. And she told me that she had a big class, and one day, because it's a dance class, there were only a few men in her class, and one day they didn't show up, so she had only the women. This was a time when I think the election of Trump had just happened or something like that, and she said she had a conversation with them, and she asked them, these are undergraduates in a dance degree program, 19, 20-year-olds, what do you think is the most important and relevant women's issue for you, for your generation? They deliberated and had a conversation, and then they determined rape. Rape is the concern that is most important for them as undergraduate students in the university. Because every weekend they go out, and one of them might experience it. Every weekend they go out, and they assign a friend to actually look out for others or whatever. It is indeed very prominent in our society, but it doesn't have to be. I recommend this report by the National Academies that addresses broader issues of sexual harassment in academia and in science fields in particular, including medicine. It does have evidence and data-driven conclusions and indicates the pervasiveness of this problem. And one important conclusion is that to reduce or prevent harassment, we need system-wide change to the culture and climate. Harassment often occurs in an environment of generalized incivility and disrespect. It is less likely to occur when organizational systems and structures support diversity, inclusion, and respect. Another conclusion is that sexual harassment training can be useful in improving knowledge of policies and behaviors that might constitute sexual harassment, but it has not been demonstrated to change people's behaviors or beliefs, similar to implicit bias training. So I want to add that often when we talk about people leaving academia or technology fields, people use this pipeline analogy. And there's a very interesting piece that appeared in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution that argued that it's impossible for the marginalized groups to solve the diversity problem themselves. Water can't fix the leaks in the pipeline. The entire community must come together to confront biases and women leaving the profession. Again, this is going to be an active link in my slides. It's a very interesting discussion about this leaky pipeline analogy, but sometimes ignoring all the multiplicative effects of all the barriers that women face, in particular here in academia. And we cannot ask women to fix these problems because they are not in enough positions of power. We need the men in leadership to seek the data on the barriers faced by women and minority groups, to believe in the evidence, and to make commitments to work actively to reduce these structural barriers. Broadening the participation of underrepresented people in STEM necessarily requires a widespread willingness, particularly by those in the majority, to acknowledge that bias exists before transformation is possible. I recommend the book, The Better Allies by Karen Caitlin, who had a 25-year career building software in Adobe. She's now a leadership coach, and she started the Better Allies Twitter handle. For an example, currently the pinned tweet has 5 things allies can do to sponsor women and underrepresented groups, like speak their name when they aren't around, share their career goals with influencers, recommend them for stretch assignments, invite them to high-profile meetings, endorse them publicly. Do something. In the latest backlash to diversity initiatives in tech, a female manager, this time, posted angrily in an internal forum. This just happened last April. She was responding to compensation incentives for hiring staff, for hiring staff on achieving diversity roles. And she just wouldn't have this. She thought this was unfair and against the merit-based culture, and again brought this idea that women are just less likely to be interested in engineering than men, not because of any bias, but because they just think differently. So again, this free choice and natural differences argument. Meanwhile, at Microsoft, the 4th annual Comprehensive Workforce Demographic Reports talks about an increase in female representation from 25.5 to 26.6%. Women in technical roles, in particular, increased from 18.5% to 19.9%. So at this rate, parity can be reached in about 22 years, I calculated. And there's similar estimates for academia and other STEM fields. It just won't happen in time for your or the next generation as we're moving now. The rate is too slow. So we need you, all of you, to make a commitment to do something. We need two ideas. We need men who are in leadership positions and decide to become allies, and more women in leadership. Use your position to hire women and promote women so that they are in a leadership position, and use whatever position you have to become an agent of change. I know I will, but it's not enough. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm available to answer questions if the time permits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorena, for the talk, and thank you for everything you do in the open source and open science space. Let's take a question. Yeah.
If yeah, it's.
Any question for Lorena?
Over there.
Over there?
Yeah. Please not the devil's advocate in the room.
A simple factual question. What's the worst behavior you've witnessed at PyData London this year?
I haven't experienced any myself, and that's good news. I have, on the contrary, observed mention of the code of conduct by the people, by the organizers and the leadership, and that is very important. It's very important that if you are the organizer and you have adopted a code of conduct, to actually state it in the beginning of the conference and keep talking about it. Thank you for your question. The answer is positive, but I do have to say that according to just the statistics of what I've found out, I know that in this room right now there will be many of you that are resistant of what I've presented today, that find this goes against the grain. I know that you are in the room somewhere. I also know there will be some women that have experienced some serious situations, and I ask for your forgiveness if I've triggered some painful thoughts. I know that there are women in the room that have had these experiences. But I think the take-home message is that as a community starts becoming aware together and working to create a culture that is respectful, and as we've seen, these things will be decreasing. And as we put more women in positions of leadership as well, and really give them equal power, we'll see those things eventually fade, hopefully. There's a lady there, that's a question. Okay.
Hi there,
Thank you
very much. I was just wondering, you were saying in the medical profession there is now some parity between women and men, but is there evidence that the sexual harassment and incidents of that have gone down, and if
Unfortunately,
there are more
no.
women in power?
Unfortunately, no. The National Academy's report that I mentioned does cite some statistics about the women experiencing sexual harassment and assault as undergraduates and in medical school and in the medical profession. Fairly regularly, 50% I think is the order of proportion of women that report that. So no, I cannot explain. I haven't become educated enough to actually explain why the medical profession desegregated so rapidly, but that hasn't changed. This is a bigger cultural concern, and it hasn't changed within that profession. Yeah, I'm happy to. You're keeper of the time.
Thank you, Lorena, for speaking about this right now. Lovely. It's such a great way to finish. Yesterday at lunch, we had the diversity conversation, and we were speaking about, so there's, from the female perspective, there's like two opposing sentiments about being given something and knowing that you're filling a quota. So I love it. I want a diversity ticket. I'm living my best life. Yes, so I don't have any issues with that. But I do have some colleagues that feel that if they win a diversity ticket, or if they get accepted and they know that it's because they're filling a quota, they feel really angry and upset about that. So what would you say to them to kind of conciliate that?
Thank you for that question. That's a very important issue. It's true, and it's both. Both men and women will react negatively towards the idea of quota, because we have this irrational belief that there's a way to measure merit, and that meritocracy is a thing that actually is fair. It's not fair, and the understanding that, first of all, starts people, softening up a little bit. Quotas are just misinterpreted because they're seen as a forceful move, but they have to be explained as a correction of something that has gone wrong. of course, some people use the equality versus equity argument. That is also sometimes misunderstood. But, you know, like we have built access for people with disabilities, you know, and ease of entering and exiting buildings, and now we accept that as a correction for including everyone that may have a physical disability. These types of assertive interventions against bias need to be understood as a corrective measure, and we need to get educated, reading the literature, so we have those arguments in the ready, that the studies demonstrate that it's better for the group overall to inject those measures, because everybody is going to benefit from the fact that these corrective measures actually improve the quality of the group. I mean, it's just counterintuitive, but the research is there, and it can be explained how that operates. So I think my recommendation is, let's get educated about it so that we're not just reacting from our gut feeling.
Hi, Lorena. Thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. A lot of companies that acknowledge these problems are now are trying to fight these problems by optimizing for gender pay gap. Obviously, it's a metric that a lot of companies are also forced to report and make public. Can you, but it's also a metric that is easy to optimize, sometimes that presumably has flaws. So what do you think about that metric? And are there other alternative metrics that can be more useful?
Metrics are always, of course, conducive to gaming in some way, so you have to be careful, but we need transparency. So it's important to push towards transparency, and I think what we need to bring into as an answer to that question is the understanding that real change will only occur when when the culture of the company and of the group has switched to so it's a collective action. In the meantime, corrective actions do work. But always the goal should be that at the end, the light at the end of the tunnel is a different culture, like the Cherokees had. And working on that is the hardest problem. Yeah. Thank you so much for staying here and sharing this topic with me. I know it's difficult, and I know it's uncomfortable, and it is for me as well. But I think this community is ready to have the difficult conversations, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity.